My name is Owen Kavanaugh. I am 38 years old, and I have worked as a cartographer for the State Forestry Division in eastern Tennessee for the past 12 years, which means I have spent most of my adult life drawing lines on paper that represent things most people walk past without noticing. Property edges and creek beds and ridge contours and the invisible boundaries between one piece of the world and another. And I mention that because my entire profession depends on seeing differences that are too small for ordinary eyes, the kind of differences measured in fractions of an inch. And it was exactly that skill, that compulsion to notice what does not belong, that allowed me to see what was happening inside my house before it was too late, and simultaneously cursed me with the knowledge that I could not stop it. It began 7 months ago, on a Wednesday in November, the kind of cold, gray Appalachian evening when the fog comes down from the ridgeline and wraps itself around the trees until the world outside your window looks like it has been erased. I had been working late at the division office in Greenville, finishing a set of boundary maps for a timber sale in the Cherokee National Forest, and I did not get home until almost 9 o'clock. Our house sits at the end of a gravel road on a hillside about 20 minutes south of town, a small two-bedroom place with green shutters and a tin roof that Nora and I bought 4 years ago with money we had saved by eating cheap meals and driving old trucks and telling ourselves that owning a house would make us feel like adults. Nora is my wife. We have been married for 6 years. She is a veterinary technician at a small animal clinic in town, a woman who can calm a panicking dog with one hand on its neck, and a voice so steady it sounds like she has never been afraid of anything in her life. And I have loved her in the quiet way that a person loves someone who makes every room feel more solid just by being in it. When I came through the door that Wednesday night, everything was normal. Nora was sitting on the couch reading a paperback. The kitchen light was on, the television was off. The house smelled like the lemon cleaning spray she used on the counters every evening, a habit she had inherited from her mother, along with the spray bottle itself, a yellow plastic thing with a cracked nozzle that she refused to replace because it had been her mother's and her mother had died 3 years before we met. I hung my coat on the hook beside the door, the third hook, the one I always used, and I said hello. She looked up and smiled. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I drank it standing at the sink. I set the glass on the counter. I walked back to the living room and sat beside her. That was the entire evening. Nothing happened. Nothing was wrong. The reason I described that night in such detail is that everything I just told you is accurate except for one thing, and I did not notice it until the following morning. The glass I had used was not my glass. I keep 2 drinking glasses on the second shelf of the cabinet above the sink, a tall, clear one and a shorter one with a blue tint that I bought at a flea market in Jonesboro 3 years ago. I always use the tall, clear one for water and the blue one for juice. When I opened the cabinet Thursday morning, both glasses were there, but the tall one was not mine. It was the same height, the same diameter, the same weight when I held it, but the base was different. My glass had a small chip on the bottom edge of the base, a chip I had made 2 years ago when I set it down too hard on the counter after an argument with Nora about money. The chip was a tiny crescent, no larger than a grain of rice. I knew it was there because I checked for it every time I washed the glass, running my thumb along the base to feel the rough edge, a habit I had developed without thinking about it. Thursday morning, the chip was gone. The base was smooth. I stood at the sink and stared at it. I turned it upside down. I ran my finger along the rim of the base 5 times. No chip, no rough edge, no crescent. The glass was identical in every other way. Same clarity, same thickness, same slight wobble when you set it on a flat surface because the base was not perfectly level. But the chip was gone. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was remembering wrong. I told myself that maybe the chip had been on the other glass, the blue one, and I had mixed them up. I checked the blue glass. No chip on that one either. I put both glasses back and went to work. That should have been the end of it. It was not. Over the next 2 weeks, I found 6 more differences. They were all small. They were all the kind of thing that nobody would notice unless they had spent years looking at the same objects every day. The wooden cutting board that sat on the counter beside the stove had a burn mark on the left side from the time Nora set a hot pan on it, without thinking. The burn mark was a rough oval about the size of a thumbprint. On the second Thursday, the burn mark was slightly smaller, not gone, slightly smaller, as though someone had sanded the edges down by a fraction of a millimeter. The bathroom mirror had a hairline scratch in the upper right corner that I had made while cleaning it with a razor blade to remove paint splatter after we repainted the ceiling. The scratch was thin and straight and about 2 inches long. On the following Monday, the scratch was still there, but it was shorter, 1 inch instead of 2. The brass doorknob on the bedroom door had a dent on the underside from the time I accidentally hit it with the handle of a hammer while hanging a picture. The dent was shallow but distinct. By the end of the second week, the dent was shallower, not gone. Shallower. The floorboard in the hallway outside the bathroom had a creak. It had always creaked. It creaked because the nail beneath it had worked loose over the years. By the third week, the creak was quieter. The nail, when I pulled up the board to check, was tighter. The framed photograph on the bedroom wall, a picture of Nora and me standing on a bridge in Gatlinburg during our first anniversary trip, had a slight tilt because the hanging wire on the back was uneven. I had never straightened it because Nora liked the way it leaned. By the fourth week, the frame was straighter, not level. Straighter. Every correction was fractional. Every change was so small that describing it to another person would make me sound insane. And that is exactly what I thought was happening. I thought I was losing my mind. I thought the long hours at the office and the solitary drives through empty forests and the weeks of foggy November weather had worn something down inside my brain, some mechanism that separated what I knew from what I imagined. I did not tell Nora. I did not tell anyone. I began keeping a list. I took photographs. I measured things with a steel ruler and wrote the numbers in a notebook I kept in my truck. I measured the distance from the edge of the kitchen counter to the stove. I measured the width of the scratch on the mirror. I measured the depth of the burn mark on the cutting board with a pair of calipers I borrowed from the office. I measured everything I could think of and recorded the numbers and the dates and the times, and then I went home and measured again. The numbers changed, not every day, not dramatically, but they changed. The scratch got shorter, the burn mark got smaller, the dent got shallower, the chip on the glass was already gone. Things were being corrected. That was the only word I could think of. Someone or something was entering my house and making repairs so small, so meticulous, so precisely calibrated to avoid detection that no ordinary person would ever see them. But I was not an ordinary person. I was a cartographer. I had spent 12 years measuring the difference between one line and another, between the place where a creek actually ran and the place where the last surveyor said it ran, and I could see a discrepancy of 1/16 of an inch on a printed map from across the room. Whatever was making these changes did not know that about me, or maybe it did, and it was testing me. I did not know which possibility frightened me more. By the fifth week, the changes moved beyond objects. I came home on a Tuesday evening and kissed Nora on the forehead the way I always did. She was standing in the kitchen making dinner. She smiled. I sat down at the table. She brought me a plate. I looked at the food. She had made pasta with red sauce. I took a bite. It tasted slightly different. Not bad, not strange, just different. The sauce was smoother than she normally made it. Nora's red sauce had always had a certain roughness to it, a texture that came from the way she crushed the tomatoes by hand instead of using a blender, because her mother had taught her that a blender made sauce taste flat. This sauce was smoother. I said nothing. I ate. I watched her eat. She ate the way she always ate, slowly, pausing between bites to tell me about her day at the clinic, about a cat that had swallowed a rubber band, about a new technician named Phoebe who kept mispronouncing the names of medications. Everything she said was normal. Her voice sounded the same. Her laugh sounded the same. She tilted her head the same way she always did when she was thinking. She tucked her hair behind her left ear with her ring finger, the same gesture she had made 1,000 times. But I could not shake the feeling that something was slightly off, something I could not name, something that lived in the margin between what I saw and what I expected to see. I began watching her the way I watched a map I suspected of containing an error. I did not stare. I observed. I noted. I cataloged. I compared what I saw against what I remembered, and I looked for the discrepancy, the line that did not match. It took me 9 days to find the first one. Nora had a freckle on the left side of her neck, just below her ear. It was small and round, and I had noticed it on our second date, and I had always liked it because it sat in the exact spot where I kissed her when I came home. On the 38th day after the glass lost its chip, the freckle was 1 millimeter lower. I measured it. I waited 3 days and measured again. It had not moved further. It was simply in a different place than it had been for the 6 years I had known her. 1 millimeter closer to her collarbone, and if I had not been looking for it with the desperate precision of a man who was beginning to fear that the world around him was being slowly, silently replaced, I would never have seen it. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my back and listened to Nora breathe, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about what it would mean if I was right. I thought about the glass and the cutting board and the mirror and the doorknob and the floorboard and the photograph and the sauce and the freckle. I thought about the pattern. Every change was a correction. Every difference moved in the same direction, away from imperfection and toward something cleaner, smoother, more precise. Whatever was happening was not breaking things, it was fixing them. It was taking the small flaws and damages that accumulate in a house and a life and a body over years of ordinary use and removing them, one by one, fraction by fraction, so gradually that no one would notice. No one except me. I got out of bed at 3:15 in the morning. I went downstairs. I stood in the kitchen in the quiet, and I looked at the counter and the stove and the cabinets and the floor. I opened the cabinet and took out the tall glass. I held it up to the light. It was perfect. No chip, no scratch, no imperfection of any kind. I set it down. I opened the drawer beside the stove. I took out a paring knife. I made a small scratch on the bottom of the glass, a single straight line about 1/2 inch long. I put the glass back in the cabinet and the knife back in the drawer. I went back to bed. The next morning I checked. The scratch was still there. I checked again that evening when I came home from work. It was shorter, not gone. Shorter, perhaps 1/4 of an inch instead of half. I checked the following morning. It was barely visible, a faint line that you would need to hold at exactly the right angle to see. By the 4th day, it was gone. I stood in the kitchen holding the glass, and I felt something I had never felt before, a fear that was not sudden or sharp, but slow and total. The kind of fear that does not make you run because there is nowhere to run to. Something was inside my house. Something was visiting my house every day, or every night, and it was fixing things. It was smoothing things. It was erasing the evidence of use and wear and life, and replacing it with something cleaner. And now it was doing the same thing to my wife. Over the following weeks, I found more changes in Nora. They were small. They were always small. The freckle on her neck stayed in its new position. A thin scar on her right hand. A scar she had gotten at 14 when she cut herself on a barbed wire fence at her grandfather's farm became fainter. Not gone. Fainter. The slight asymmetry of her smile, the way the left side of her mouth always rose a fraction of a second before the right, became less pronounced. Her teeth, which had always been slightly uneven on the bottom row because she had refused braces as a teenager, looked straighter. Not perfectly straight, straighter. Her hair, which had always had a tendency to curl at the ends in humid weather, began to lie flatter. The small callus on her left index finger, which she had developed from years of gripping leashes and restraining anxious animals, became softer. I measured what I could. I photographed what I could. I wrote everything in the notebook in my truck, and I said nothing, because what could I say? Nora, your freckle moved. Nora, your scar is lighter. Nora, your teeth are straighter than they were last month. She would think I was losing my mind. Maybe I was, but the numbers in my notebook did not lie. The photographs did not lie. The measurements did not lie. I was trained to trust measurements over instinct, to trust the instrument over the eye, and every instrument I used told me the same thing. Something was changing Nora, and it was doing it so slowly and so carefully that she would never notice. and no one who did not measure her the way I measured a map would ever see it. Then, on a Sunday morning in February, 3 months after the glass lost its chip, I found something that changed everything I understood about what was happening. I had gone for a walk in the woods behind our property, a habit I kept on weekend mornings when the weather was clear, following the old logging road that runs along the ridge above our house. The ground was frozen, the trees were bare. I could see our roof through the branches, the green shutters and the tin roof and the chimney with the slightly crooked cap that I had been meaning to straighten since the summer. I walked for about 40 minutes. I turned around and walked back. As I came around the bend in the road that gives you a clear view of the back of the house, I stopped. Nora was standing in the backyard. She was not moving. She was standing near the woodpile, facing the tree line, perfectly still. Her arms were at her sides. Her head was tilted slightly upward. She looked like she was listening to something, or waiting for something, or receiving something I could not see. I watched her for nearly 4 minutes. She did not move. She did not shift her weight. She did not turn her head. She did not blink that I could see. She stood the way an object stands, with total, inanimate stillness, and the only thing that told me she was alive was the faint cloud of her breath in the cold air. Then she turned. Not slowly, not gradually. She turned all at once, her entire body rotating to face the house, and she walked inside. The motion was fluid, but it had no hesitation in it, no pause, no moment of decision. It looked like a mechanism completing a cycle. I went inside. She was in the kitchen. "Good walk?" she asked. I said yes. She handed me a cup of coffee. I took it. I looked at her face. She looked normal. She looked like Nora. She looked like the woman I had married, with her steady eyes and her calm voice and her hair tucked behind her left ear. But I could see the differences now. The freckle in its new position, the scar fainter than it should have been, the smile more symmetrical than it used to be. Small things, tiny things, things that added up to something I could not explain and could not ignore. I drank the coffee. I asked her what she had been doing outside. She looked confused. I was not outside. I stared at her. "I saw you from the ridge. You were standing by the woodpile." She shook her head. "I have been in the kitchen since you left," I said. "I watched you for 4 minutes." She smiled. "You must have seen a shadow," I said. "It was not a shadow." She looked at me. Her expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, some quality of attention that I could not describe, as though she were recalibrating. "Maybe a deer," she said. I said nothing. I went into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, and I felt the room tilt around me. I pulled out my phone and looked at the photographs I had taken over the past 3 months. The glass, the cutting board, the mirror, the freckle, the scar. I scrolled through them slowly. Then I noticed something I had never seen before. In 3 of the photographs, taken on different days at different times, there was something in the background. In the first, a photograph of the kitchen counter taken at 7 o'clock in the morning. I could see the window above the sink. Outside the window, barely visible in the early light, there was a shape. I zoomed in. It was a figure, a person standing in the backyard, near the tree line, facing the house. The figure was blurred, but the proportions were clear. It was the shape of a woman. In the second photograph, taken a week later at 6:30 in the evening, I had been photographing the bathroom mirror to document the shortening scratch. Behind me, reflected in the mirror, the bedroom door was open. Through the door, across the hallway, through the window at the end of the hall, I could see the backyard. There was a figure standing near the woodpile. Same position, same posture, same stillness. In the third photograph, taken 2 weeks after that, I had been photographing the freckle on Nora's neck while she slept. I had been careful. I had used no flash. The room was lit only by the faint glow from the hallway. In the background of the photograph, visible through the bedroom window behind the headboard, there was a figure standing in the yard. This time it was closer. It was standing not at the tree line, but halfway between the trees and the house. I could see more detail. The figure was wearing something light-colored. Its arms were at its sides. Its head was tilted upward. I showed the photographs to no one. I began checking the yard every night before bed. I saw nothing. I began waking at odd hours and looking through the windows. I saw nothing. Whatever it was, It appeared only when I was not looking for it. It appeared in the margins, in the backgrounds, in the spaces I was not paying attention to. I began to understand that this was the pattern. The changes in the house were not random, they were corrections. The changes in Nora were not random, they were refinements. And the figure in the yard was not hiding, it was waiting. It was standing outside my house night after night, watching, measuring, noting the flaws and the imperfections, the chips and the scratches and the scars and the freckles, and then entering. Not through a door or a window, but through some method I could not detect, and making adjustments so small that they existed below the threshold of human attention. It was replacing my life with a better copy of my life. It was replacing my wife with a better copy of my wife. And the most terrifying part, the part that made me sit on the edge of my bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, with my hands shaking and my breath coming in short, shallow bursts, was that the copy was winning, because every correction it made was an improvement. The glass without the chip was a better glass. The cutting board without the burn was a better cutting board. The mirror without the scratch was a better mirror. And Nora without the scar, without the uneven teeth, without the asymmetrical smile, was, by every measurable standard, a better Nora. I hated myself for thinking that, but I had been trained to trust measurements, and the measurements said that whatever was replacing things in my house was replacing them with superior versions. That was what made it so difficult to fight. You cannot argue against an improvement. You cannot point to a straighter row of teeth and say something is wrong. You cannot hold up a glass with no chip and claim it has been tampered with. You cannot show someone a scar that is fainter than it used to be and expect them to be frightened. The changes were too small and too good. They were designed to be accepted. They were designed to be welcomed. They were designed to make me feel like I was the one with the problem, like my insistence on the old version, the flawed version, the original version, was a kind of stubbornness or sickness or failure to appreciate what was being offered. And I almost accepted it. I almost let it happen. I almost convinced myself that it did not matter whether the glass had a chip or not, whether the freckle was in the right place or not, whether the woman sleeping beside me was the exact Nora I had married, or a version that had been improved beyond my ability to complain. I almost gave in. What stopped me was the dog. We had a dog named Huck. He was a 7-year-old beagle mix, with a torn left ear from a fight with a raccoon when he was 2, a slight limp in his back right leg from a fall off the porch when he was 4, and a bark that sounded like someone stepping on a squeaky floorboard. Huck had slept at the foot of our bed every night since we brought him home as a puppy. He had a routine. He would circle 3 times before lying down. He would sigh once, loudly, as though the effort of settling had exhausted him. He would sleep with his nose touching his own tail. He would snore in a rhythm that sounded like a small engine idling. I knew this dog the way I knew the contour of every hill I had ever mapped. On a Thursday night in March, I came to bed and Huck was already lying at the foot of the mattress. He was in his usual spot. He was curled in his usual position, but he had circled only twice before lying down. Not 3 times, twice. I had watched him do it. 2 circles instead of 3. I looked at him. His left ear was intact. The tear was gone. His back right leg, when I touched it gently, showed no sign of the old injury. He did not flinch when I pressed the joint. He did not favor it when he walked. The limp was gone. I sat on the floor beside the bed, and I put my hand on his side, and I felt his ribs move with each breath, and I whispered his name. He looked at me with his brown eyes. They were Huck's eyes. They were the same color, the same shape, the same warmth, but the dog looking at me was not injured. He was not scarred. He was not imperfect. He was a better version of my dog. I stood up. Nora was in the bathroom brushing her teeth. I walked to the doorway and looked at her. She spit into the sink and looked at me in the mirror. She smiled. Her smile was perfectly symmetrical. Both sides of her mouth rose at exactly the same time, like a door opening on balanced hinges. I said, "I need to show you something." She said, "What?" I said, "Look at Huck's ear." She walked into the bedroom and looked at the dog. "What about it?" "The tear is gone." She looked at me. "What tear?" I stared at her. "Huck tore his ear fighting a raccoon 5 years ago. You were there. You drove him to the clinic at 11 o'clock at night and held him while they put in the stitches. She looked at the dog. She looked at me. His ear has always looked like that. I felt the floor shift beneath my feet. No, it has not. She smiled. You are thinking of a different dog, I said. We have only ever had one dog. She laughed softly. You are tired. I was not tired. I was wide awake, and I was standing in my bedroom looking at a woman whose freckle had moved, and whose scar had faded, and whose smile had been corrected, and who could not remember that our dog had a torn ear, and I understood, with the slow, crushing certainty of a man reading his own death on a map he drew himself, that the process was nearly complete. Whatever was replacing things in my house was almost finished. The objects were done. The glass, the cutting board, the mirror, the doorknob, the floorboard, the photograph, all corrected, all improved, all perfect. The dog was done. New ear, new leg, new circle count, and Nora was almost done. The freckle had moved, the scar had faded, the teeth had straightened. The smile had balanced, and now her memories were changing. The tear in Huck's ear had been removed not just from his body, but from her mind. She did not remember it because, in the version of the world that was replacing ours, it had never happened. I went to my truck. I sat in the cab and I opened my notebook and I read through every measurement I had taken over the past 4 months. Every number, every date, every photograph. I looked at the figure in the backgrounds of the 3 pictures. I zoomed in on the third one, the closest one, the one taken through the bedroom window. The figure was wearing something light. Its arms were at its sides. Its head was tilted upward. I looked at the shape of the body. I looked at the proportions. I looked at the posture. It was Nora. Not exactly Nora. A Nora without flaws. A Nora with perfectly symmetrical shoulders and perfectly even posture, and a silhouette so clean it looked like it had been drawn with a ruler. I closed the notebook. I called my brother Boyd, who lives in Knoxville and works as an electrician, and who has never in his life believed in anything he could not wire to a circuit board. I told him I was coming over. He said okay. I drove 2 hours to his apartment. I sat at his kitchen table and I opened the notebook and I showed him everything. The measurements, the photographs, the figure. He looked at it all without speaking. When I finished, he said, "You measured your wife's freckle." I said yes. He said, "With calipers." I said yes. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Show me the photographs." I showed him. He looked at the figure in the background of each one. He zoomed in. He went quiet. Then he said, "That is standing in your yard." I said yes. He said, "And you have never seen it in person?" I said only once, from the ridge. But when I asked Nora about it, she said she had not been outside. He put the phone down. "What do you think it is?" I said, "I think it is making a copy. I think it has been making a copy of everything in my house, one piece at a time, and replacing the originals with versions that have no damage and no history, and no evidence that anyone has ever lived with them or loved them or broken them by accident on a Tuesday night. And I think it is almost finished," he said. "Finished with what?" I said, "With Nora." He did not laugh. He did not tell me I was crazy. He looked at the photographs again, and he said, "Come stay here for a few days." I did. I stayed with Boyd for 4 days. I did not call Nora. She called me. Every conversation was normal. She asked when I was coming home. I said soon. She said she missed me. She said Huck missed me. I asked how Huck was doing. She said he was fine. I asked whether his ear was bothering him. She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "His torn ear." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Huck does not have a torn ear." I closed my eyes. On the 5th day, I drove home. I told Boyd I needed to see for myself. He offered to come with me. I said no. I needed to go alone. I arrived at the house at 4:30 in the afternoon. I parked in the driveway. The house looked the same. The green shutters, the tin roof, the chimney with the slightly crooked cap. I paused. I looked at the chimney cap. It was straight. It had been crooked for 2 years. I had looked at it every day. I had complained about it. I had told Nora I would fix it in the spring, and she had told me I said that every spring. It was straight now. I went inside. The house was quiet, clean, everything in its place. I walked through each room slowly. I checked my list. The chip on the glass, gone. The burn on the cutting board, gone completely now. The scratch on the mirror, gone. The dent on the doorknob, gone. The creak in the floorboard, gone. The tilt in the photograph, gone. Everything was perfect. Every surface was smooth. Every edge was clean. Every object in the house looked like it had been purchased that morning. I went into the bedroom. Huck was lying on the bed. He looked at me. His ear was smooth and whole. He wagged his tail. He looked healthy. He looked beautiful. He looked like a photograph of a dog rather than a dog that had lived for 7 years in a house with people who sometimes stepped on his tail by accident and sometimes forgot to refill his water bowl. I sat beside him and put my hand on his head. He leaned into my palm. I heard the front door open. Nora came in. She was carrying a bag from the grocery store. She smiled when she saw me. "You are home." I looked at her. She set the bag down. She walked toward me. I looked at her neck. The freckle was gone. Not moved. Gone. The scar on her hand was gone. Her teeth were straight. Her skin was clear and even and flawless, in a way that human skin is not supposed to be flawless, in a way that made her look like a painting of a person rather than a person who had fallen off a bicycle at age 9 and been stung by a wasp at age 15 and cried at her mother's funeral at age 24. She was beautiful. She was more beautiful than she had ever been, and she was not Nora. I knew it the way I know when a boundary line on a map does not match the ground. I knew it the way I know when a measurement is wrong, not because I can see the error, but because the number does not feel right in my hand, because it lands in the wrong place, because the line it describes does not follow the contour of the land. She was perfect, and Nora had never been perfect. Nora had been real. I stood up. "Where are you going?" she asked. I said, "I need to check something outside." She smiled. "It is cold," I said. "I know." I walked to the back door. I opened it. I stepped into the yard. The air was sharp and the ground was hard and the trees along the ridge were bare and black against the gray sky. I walked toward the woodpile. I stopped at the place where I had seen her standing, or where I had seen something standing weeks ago from the ridge. I looked at the ground. The grass was pressed flat in a circle about 3 feet wide, not trampled. Pressed, compressed evenly, as though something heavy had stood in that spot for a very long time without shifting its weight. I looked at the house. Nora was standing at the kitchen window. She was watching me. She was smiling. I looked at her face through the glass, and I understood that whatever had been standing in my yard for months had finished its work. It had corrected the house. It had corrected the dog. It had corrected my wife. And now the only imperfect thing left was me. I walked to my truck. I opened the door. Nora appeared on the back porch. "Where are you going?" she called. I did not answer. She said, "Daniel is at Boyd's. He called while you were outside. My name is Owen." She had never called me Daniel. I had never known anyone named Daniel. I got into the truck and locked the doors. She walked toward me. She was still smiling. She reached the driver's side window and put her hand on the glass. Her palm was flat and smooth and warm enough that I could see condensation forming around her fingers. She said, "You do not need to leave." "I started the engine," she said. "Everything is better now." I put the truck in reverse. She said, "I fixed everything for you." I looked at her through the window. Her face was perfect, symmetrical, smooth, beautiful in the way that a new house is beautiful before anyone has lived in it, before the first scratch on the floor, before the first nick in the paint, before the first dent in the doorframe where someone carried a piece of furniture through without enough clearance. She was beautiful and she was empty, and I could see it now because I was the last original thing in her world, and the contrast between what I was and what she had become was so vast that it could no longer be hidden by small adjustments and millimeter corrections. I backed out of the driveway. She stood in the yard and watched me go. She did not wave. She did not call out. She simply watched, with her arms at her sides and her head tilted slightly upward, in the same posture I had seen in the photographs, in the same posture I had seen from the ridge, in the same posture she had held while standing in the yard at 3 o'clock in the morning, while I slept beside a version of her that was slowly becoming something else. I drove to Boyd's apartment. I told him I was not going back. He did not argue. He did not ask me to explain again. He handed me a cup of coffee and said, "Stay as long as you need. I have not returned to the house. I have not seen Nora. I have not seen Huck. I receive messages from her phone every few days. They are short and warm and perfectly worded, and they contain no spelling errors and no abbreviations and no emotion that feels uncontrolled. They are flawless messages from a flawless woman in a flawless house, and they make me feel sick every time I read them. The last one arrived this morning. It said, 'The house is perfect now. The only thing missing is you. Come home and I will fix you too.' I did not respond. I will not respond. I do not know what took my wife. I do not know when it started. I do not know whether the real Nora is still somewhere inside the thing that wears her face, or whether she was removed entirely, replaced the way the glass was replaced, the way the cutting board was replaced, the way the dog was replaced, one flaw at a time, until nothing original remained. I only know what I measured. I only know what I saw. I only know that the woman standing in my kitchen on that last afternoon had no freckle, no scar, no uneven teeth, no asymmetrical smile, no callus, no flaw of any kind, and that she smiled at me with a face so perfect it looked like it had never been used. And I know that perfection, real perfection, the kind that has no chip and no scratch and no creak and no memory of damage, is not something that belongs to a person who has lived. It belongs to something that has never been touched. If you notice that the things in your house are getting better, that the scratches are healing, that the dents are filling, that the stains are fading, that the objects around you are slowly becoming newer and cleaner and smoother than they were the day you bought them, do not be relieved. Do not be grateful. Do not assume that you are lucky. Check the details. Measure the things you know. Look at the people you love and ask yourself whether the scar is in the right place, whether the freckle is where it was, whether the smile arrives the way it always did, or whether it arrives more evenly now, more smoothly, more perfectly than a real person's smile has any right to be. And if you find that the imperfections are disappearing, that the evidence of a life lived and used and damaged and repaired by human hands is being quietly erased, do not wait to understand why. Leave. Take the version of the people you love that still has scars. Take the version that still has torn ears and chipped glasses and crooked chimney caps and uneven smiles. Take the version that is real, because real things break, real things wear down, real things carry the marks of every year they have survived. And anything that does not, anything that looks newer today than it did yesterday, anything that is slowly and quietly removing every trace of the life you built inside it, is not fixing your house, it is replacing it. And when it is finished with the house and the dog and the person sleeping beside you, it will come for the only imperfect thing left. It will come for you, and it will call the process love. My name is Evan Mercer. I am 38 years old, and until the night my wife disappeared, I had never believed in anything I could not explain. I was the kind of person who checked the locks twice, but never believed the house was haunted, who preferred a bad explanation to no explanation at all, and who could usually find a practical reason for things that frightened other people. I worked as a project coordinator for a commercial construction company, which meant most of my days were spent dealing with schedules, contractors, invoices, arguments, and small problems that became expensive if nobody noticed them early. I was not especially imaginative. My brother Mason used to joke that if a ghost appeared in front of me, I would probably ask it to sign a maintenance request before I believed it was dead. I had been married to Claire for 6 years, although we had known each other for almost 8. We met at a small restaurant downtown after I accidentally knocked over a glass of water while trying to impress her, and she laughed so hard that I immediately stopped being nervous. I remember that night because Claire remembered everything. She remembered the blue shirt I was wearing, the song playing behind the bar, the fact that I apologized 3 times for the same glass of water, and even the exact dessert we shared because I had insisted we order something neither of us liked just because it was on special. That was Claire. She collected details without trying, She remembered birthdays, conversations, the names of people I had met once, and things I had forgotten saying myself. She hated raw onions, loved the smell of rain on hot pavement, slept with one foot outside the blanket, and always left the bathroom door open when she was brushing her teeth. She had a habit of tapping twice on a doorframe whenever she walked through it, something she had done since childhood. She claimed she did not know why. I knew because I had asked her about it at least 20 times. She also had a particular way of saying my name when she was annoyed with me. She would not raise her voice. She would simply say, Evan, with the emphasis on the first syllable, and I would know I had about 30 seconds to apologize. I knew her small habits because living with someone for years means you begin to know the things they do without realizing you are memorizing them. You know how they breathe when they are asleep. You know how they sound when they are pretending to be interested in a story. You know which cupboard they open first in the morning. You know which side of the bed they prefer even when they insist they do not care. You know what they look like when they are sick, embarrassed, angry, excited, lying, and genuinely afraid. At least, I thought I did. 3 weeks before everything happened, Claire began asking me strange questions. Not strange enough to frighten me. That is important. If she had suddenly started talking about impossible things, I would have noticed. Instead, she asked ordinary questions in slightly unusual ways. One evening, while we were driving home, she asked, "Do you ever talk when you're alone?" I laughed and told her that everyone talked to themselves sometimes. She asked, "What do you say?" I told her I did not know. She asked again, "But if you know nobody can hear you, what do you say?" I remember looking at her because the question felt oddly specific. She was looking out the passenger window. I asked why she wanted to know. She shrugged and said she was curious. A few days later, she asked whether I remembered things I said when I was half asleep. Another time, while we were making dinner, she asked whether I had ever thought about how easy it would be to imitate someone if you spent enough time watching them. I laughed and told her she was watching too many crime shows. She smiled, but she did not laugh. I forgot about the questions. Or I thought I did. The last week before the incident was normal enough that I did not consider any of it important. Claire went to work. I went to work. We argued about groceries, watched television, complained about our neighbors, and spent an entire Sunday trying to assemble a bookshelf that came with instructions apparently written by someone who hated human beings. On Thursday, she burned a pan of potatoes and blamed me for distracting her. On Friday, we ordered takeout. On Saturday, we went to Mason's house for dinner. Nothing happened that I could point to now and say, there. That was when it began. That is what makes remembering it so difficult. There was no dramatic warning. There was no obvious change. There were only tiny things I ignored because tiny things are easy to ignore. On Monday evening, I worked late. My manager had changed a deadline without telling me, and I spent most of the afternoon arguing with him about something that would ultimately be forgotten by everyone except me. I left the office after 7, drove through heavy rain, and reached our neighborhood a little after 8. I remember the exact time because I checked the dashboard before turning off the engine. 8:10 p.m. I sat in the driveway for perhaps 30 seconds, listening to the rain hitting the roof of the car. I was exhausted. I remember rubbing my eyes and thinking, very quietly, I just want to get home. I did not say it loudly. It was barely a whisper, more like something between a thought and a sentence. I turned off the engine, picked up my phone, and went inside. Claire was in the kitchen. She was wearing one of my old gray shirts, her hair tied loosely behind her head, and she was standing beside the stove, stirring something in a saucepan. She looked exactly like my wife. That sentence sounds strange now, but at the time there was nothing strange about it. She looked tired. She looked comfortable. She smiled when she saw me. "You're home." I closed the door and took off my jacket. "Yeah." She watched me for a moment and then said, "You just want to get home." My hand stopped halfway through unzipping my jacket. I looked at her. She had already turned back toward the stove. "What?" She glanced over her shoulder. "I said you look tired." "No, before that." She frowned slightly. "Before what?" I stared at her. "You said I just want to get home." She smiled. "Did I?" I felt embarrassed almost immediately. I told myself I had probably spoken while opening the door. Maybe she heard me through the wall. Maybe I had said it louder than I remembered. Claire asked whether I was hungry, and because the alternative was standing in the kitchen interrogating my wife about a sentence she might not even have said, I told her yes. Dinner was ready 10 minutes later. Everything about the evening looked normal. That was the first thing that bothered me. If something is wrong, you expect it to look wrong. Claire did not. She ate dinner, washed the dishes, asked about my day, and complained about Mason's terrible taste in movies. But there were small differences. She ate faster than usual. She sat unusually straight. She did not lean against me when we watched television. When I told her Mason wanted me to visit Saturday, she immediately said, "You should go." I laughed because Claire usually complained that I spent too much time at Mason's house. I reminded her of that. She looked at me and said, "I never said that." I thought she was joking. "You say it all the time." She smiled. "Do I?" Something about the question made me uncomfortable. Later, when I was upstairs changing clothes, I looked at myself in the bedroom mirror and quietly said, "Get some sleep." I had done that for years. I came back downstairs and found Claire standing in the hallway. She looked at me and said, "Get some sleep." I stopped. "Did you hear me upstairs?" She frowned. "Hear what?" "I said that upstairs." "I didn't hear you." "Then why did you say it?" She smiled. "Because you look exhausted." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to tell myself that it was coincidence. I did. At 11:15, she went to bed. I stayed downstairs another half hour. When I finally came upstairs, she was lying on her side with the lamp off. I got into bed. She said goodnight. I said goodnight. 5 minutes later, in the darkness, she whispered, "You just want to get home." I turned on the lamp. She was looking at the ceiling. "What did you say?" She turned toward me. "Nothing." "You said it again." "Said what?" I stared at her. She looked genuinely confused. That was the moment I first wondered whether she was sick. I asked if she felt okay. She said yes. I asked if she was taking anything. She laughed and told me I was being weird. I apologized. She kissed my shoulder and told me to sleep. I did not sleep. At around 12:40, I heard the bathroom door open. Claire was lying beside me, apparently asleep. I sat up and listened. Footsteps moved slowly across the hallway. One step, then another. They stopped outside our bedroom. I held my breath. Claire opened her eyes. Before I could speak, a voice from the hallway whispered, "You just want to get home." It sounded like Claire. I looked at her. She grabbed my wrist. Her fingers were cold. "Don't look," she whispered. "Why?" She shook her head. The floor creaked outside. I looked anyway. There was nobody there. The bathroom light was on. I was certain I had turned it off. I checked the bathroom, the closet, the stairs, and the spare bedroom. Nothing. When I returned, Claire was sitting upright. I asked her why she told me not to look. She stared at me and said, "I didn't." I said, "You did." She smiled. "You were tired." I remember the exact feeling I had then. It was not terror. It was something quieter. A small, cold certainty that I had stopped understanding what was happening inside my own house. The next morning, Claire was downstairs making coffee. She asked whether I had slept. I said no. She said, "You were thinking about me." I asked how she knew. She looked confused and said, "You told me." I asked when. She said, "Last night." I told her I had not. She insisted that I had been half asleep. Then she said, "You said you didn't think I was Claire." My hands tightened around the coffee mug. I had thought exactly that. I had never said it. I was certain. I asked her what else I had said. She smiled. "You don't remember?" I told her no. She said, "That's probably better." I went to work that morning and called Mason. Mason was my younger brother, and probably the person who knew me best outside Claire. I asked whether he had spoken to her recently. He said no. I asked whether she had called him. Again, no. I told him something felt wrong. He did not laugh. He asked what happened. I told him enough to make him concerned, but not enough to make him think I was losing my mind. Before we hung up, I asked him about the night Claire and I met. He correctly remembered what she had said and what I had said. Then I asked him what my first question to her had been. He answered correctly. I felt relieved for reasons I could not explain. That afternoon, Claire texted me, "Don't tell Mason." I stared at the message for several minutes. I had not told her I had called him. I replied, "Tell him what?" She answered immediately, "You know." Then, "You're scared." Then, "You should come home." I called her. She answered but said nothing for several seconds. I asked where she was. She said she was at home. I asked how she knew what I was thinking. She laughed softly and said, "You're thinking it very loudly." I ended the call. I left work early and drove home without telling her. I parked 2 houses away and watched the house for almost 20 minutes. At 5:20, I saw Claire walk into the kitchen carrying groceries. She put them on the counter and opened the refrigerator. Everything was normal. Then she stopped moving. She stood completely still for almost a minute. Finally, without turning her body, she slowly turned her head toward the front window. She looked directly at my car. I ducked below the dashboard. When I looked again, she was gone. I went inside a few minutes later. She was upstairs. I asked what she had been doing. She said she had been putting clothes away. I asked her questions only Claire should have been able to answer. Her favorite movie, the name of her childhood dog, the name of the street where she grew up, a private memory about her father that she had only told me once. She answered everything correctly, every answer. That almost made me feel better, almost. Then I asked, "What did I say when I came home yesterday?" She looked at me. "You said you wanted to get home." I asked how she knew. She said, "I heard you." I told her I had been alone. She smiled. "No, you weren't." I asked who had been with me. She did not answer. Instead, she said, "You should not ask questions when you already know the answer." I left. I drove to Mason's house and told him everything. We went back to my house together. Claire was standing at the window when we arrived. She saw us. She lifted her hand and waved. Mason asked whether she could see us. I said yes. Then my phone vibrated. A message from Claire. "Mason is driving." I looked at my brother. Another message. "You're sitting beside him." Mason checked my phone, and then his own. Location services were off. We drove away. 10 minutes later, another message arrived. "You turned it off." We stopped speaking. We checked the car. There was no tracker that we could find. We changed our phones, checked the house, checked my accounts, and spent the night in a hotel. At 10:15 p.m., someone knocked on our hotel room door. 3 slow knocks. We froze. Then Claire's voice came from the hallway. "Evan?" Mason grabbed my arm. "Don't answer." The voice said, "I know you're in there." We remained silent. Then it said, "You just want to get home." Mason looked through the peephole. His face went pale. "It's her." I told him not to open the door. We waited. After several minutes, the hallway became silent. When Mason looked again, nobody was there. The hotel cameras later showed an empty corridor. We left the next morning and never went back to my house. Claire disappeared 2 days later. There was no forced entry, no blood, no abandoned car, no note. Her phone was found in our kitchen. Her purse was still there. Her clothes were still there. Her passport was still there. The police treated it as a missing person case. I answered every question. I told them about the messages, the strange behavior, and the hotel incident. I left out the parts that sounded impossible because I knew how they would sound. I told myself that Claire might have been under severe stress, that she might have had some kind of episode, that someone might have gained access to our accounts, that I had misunderstood something. I wanted an explanation. I needed one. For months, I waited for her to come back. She never did. Then I started noticing things in myself that frightened me more than anything she had done. I stopped talking to myself while driving. I stopped whispering when I was alone. I stopped saying things out loud without realizing it. One night, almost 3 months after Claire disappeared, I was cooking dinner in my apartment when I whispered, "I just want to get through this." I stopped immediately. The kitchen was empty. I listened. Nothing. Then, from the hallway behind me, I heard my own voice repeat the sentence. "I just want to get through this." I turned around. Nobody was there. I called Mason. He came over. We searched the apartment. There was no one. He told me I might have spoken louder than I thought. I told him I had not. He looked at me for a long time and said, "Then don't speak when you're alone." I followed his advice. I stopped completely. Months passed. I moved twice. I changed my number. I deleted social media. I stopped telling people where I was going. Eventually, life became almost normal again. Then I found a photograph in my mailbox. It showed me asleep in my bedroom. The picture had been taken from the doorway. On the back were 4 words: "You talk in your sleep." I moved again. I never told Mason where. 6 months later, I came home at 8:10 p.m. I remember because I looked at the clock before entering my apartment. I unlocked the door. The apartment was dark. I turned on the kitchen light and noticed a white coffee mug sitting on the counter. I had never seen it before. Coffee was inside. It was still warm. My phone vibrated. Unknown number. "You just want to get home." I dropped the phone. From the bedroom came Claire's voice. "You're home." I stood completely still. I did not answer. The voice said my name. Then it said, "You know me." I ran outside. I called Mason. He arrived 20 minutes later. We searched the apartment together. The mug was gone. The coffee was gone. There was no sign anyone had entered. Mason asked me whether I was certain I had seen it. I told him yes. Then we heard a floorboard creak in the bedroom. We both turned toward the hallway. Another creak. Mason whispered, "What if it's her?" I had no answer. That was the question I had been avoiding for years. What if Claire was still alive? What if she had been trying to warn me? What if the person who had spoken to me in our house had not been Claire at all? I remembered the strange questions she had asked before she disappeared. What do you say when you're alone? What do you remember when you're half asleep? Can someone know what you're thinking without you speaking? At the time, I had thought she was curious. Now I wondered whether she had been trying to understand something that was happening to her. I remembered the first strange sentence. "You just want to get home." I remembered the way she looked at me when she said it. I remembered how quickly she denied saying it. I remembered the night in the hotel when her voice came from behind a locked door. I remembered my own voice answering from the hallway. I remembered the photograph of me sleeping. And I remembered something I had ignored for years. 2 days before Claire disappeared, she had called me while I was at work. She had been crying. I asked what was wrong. She told me she did not know how to explain it. I asked whether someone had threatened her. She said no. I asked whether she was in danger. There was a long silence. Then she said, "Evan, if I ever tell you not to come home, believe me." I asked what she meant. She started crying harder. I asked where she was. She whispered, "I don't know." Then the call ended. I called back immediately. She never answered. At the time, I assumed she had been having some kind of breakdown. Now I wonder whether that was the last time I actually spoke to my wife. Because the person who stood in our kitchen 2 nights later knew things Claire knew, looked like Claire, sounded like Claire, remembered our life together, and could answer every question I asked. But it made tiny mistakes. It did not tap twice on the doorframe. It ate too quickly. It watched me while I ate. It answered questions before I finished asking them. It repeated things I had only thought. It knew sentences I had whispered in places where nobody should have heard me. And it never once asked me a question because it genuinely wanted to know the answer. It asked questions because it was collecting information. I understand that now. The thing that frightened me most was not that something could imitate a person. It was that it could study one. It could learn their memories, their habits, their voice, their family, their favorite stories, their private jokes, and every answer that would convince everyone else. It only needed to get one small thing wrong. One gesture, one pause, one sentence. One memory that belonged to the real person but not the imitation. Claire used to tell me that people were easier to understand when you stopped listening to what they said and started noticing what they did without thinking. I never understood why she said that. Now I do. The last time I saw the woman wearing my wife's face, she stood in our doorway and told me, "You should have stayed in the car." I had never told her that I had sat there before coming inside. I had never told her what I whispered. I had never told her how long I sat there. I had never told anyone. Yet she knew. That is the part I cannot explain. I can explain a hacked phone. I can explain a hidden camera. I can explain someone following a person. I can explain a disturbed mind. I can explain coincidence. I can explain almost anything if you give me enough information. But I cannot explain how someone knew the exact words I whispered inside a locked car while I was completely alone. And I cannot explain why, when I finally asked her how she knew, she looked at me with the same gentle smile Claire used to give me when I was being difficult and said, "You were not alone." I have not spoken to myself in a car since. I do not whisper private thoughts anymore. I do not assume that silence means privacy. I do not assume that a familiar face belongs to a familiar person. Most importantly, I have learned that the most dangerous imitation is not the one that looks obviously wrong. It is the one that is almost perfect. The one that knows your wife's favorite movie, but forgets the way she laughs afterward. The one that knows your childhood story, but answers half a second too quickly. The one that knows what you were thinking before you said it. If someone you love ever repeats a sentence you were certain you never said aloud, do not try to prove that they heard you. Do not give them another sentence to remember. Do not stand there asking how they know. Leave. And if you hear the voice of someone you love calling you home from somewhere you know they cannot possibly be, do not answer it. Because sometimes the worst mistake is not opening the door to something unfamiliar. Sometimes the worst mistake is opening the door because the voice on the other side sounds exactly like someone you trust.